When I took my college evolution class, my professor said that Darwin was probably the last person who could really be considered a naturalist, because after that point, the expansion of knowledge about the natural world had expanded to the point that it couldn't all be contained in one person's brain anymore. Darwin's conception of his ideas to explain the processes of his descent with modification were based largely on observations of living things in their natural environments, as well as some experimentizing that he did at home. This is his basic formulation. Darwin knew that artificial selection worked on individual traits like kernel color in corn, or friendliness in dogs, or plumage color in fancy pigeons. Single traits were the kinds of things that breeders were able to enhance in their animals through directed mating because offspring tended to resemble their parents. In the wild, if some combination of traits made an individual to be better fit to their environment, then they would tend to have more offspring than average. The individuals that possess the better sum total of traits with the minimum amount of metabolic energy to deploy them will have more offspring that also fit better into that environment. Fitness is measured as the relative reproductive success compared to the average reproductive output of members of a population. Individuals that fit well into their environment have more spare metabolic energy available for reproduction, so their offspring that also have that suite of advantageous traits start to swamp the population in subsequent generations. So history is written by the winners. Extending his idea past animal husbandry, over many, many generations, this process should be sufficient to explain the divergence of populations in particular environments. With continued mutation, these morphologically divergent populations can eventually become reproductively isolated into different species. Darwin envisioned that natural selection was constantly weighing and measuring the benefit or detriment of each attribute of the phenotype on the differential survival and reproduction of the individual in the complex conditions of life. So, this was the sum total of the organism, from coat color to limb length to behavioral reflexes to visual acuity to metabolic rate, and assessing how all of these traits could increase reproductive success in the most economical way possible. Populations would become better fit to a stable environment, or they should track the changes in a more variable one. Now, our understanding of these elements can be a little different today. Darwin could identify variation and understood that offspring tended to resemble their parents, but he didn't know anything modern about genetics. Mendel's work wasn't published anywhere until about 1866, and The Origin was first published in 1859. It's clear that Mendel had read Darwin's books, and he did send a letter to Darwin, but that letter arrived very shortly before Darwin's death, and there's no evidence from his notebooks that Mendel's letter was read and that he understood its importance and relevance of his genetic laws to Darwin's research on evolution. Recall that the modern evolutionary synthesis was the mid-20th century integration of the genetic explanations of variation and heritability with Darwinian natural selection as the sorting mechanism to explain the evolution of populations over generational time. We will tackle more of these individual aspects later. Your textbooks make some good points about aspects of natural selection that are important to bear in mind. First, mutations might result in traits that could either be advantageous or deleterious, but mutations occur and are expressed irrespective of any benefit to fitness. Even though a mutation might be beneficial, it doesn't make that mutation more likely to happen than a harmful one. Mutation isn't exactly random, but it's random enough for most of the purposes that we'll work with. Second, evolutionary biologists focus on how traits of interest vary over evolutionary time. These traits might be the product of one gene or several genes. They might be environmentally plastic or the product of behavior, but we focus on phenotypes regardless of how the trait comes to be a part of the body. Third, remember that individuals are born with some variation, but individuals themselves do not evolve. Populations are the smallest taxonomic group that actually evolves, that actually changes over generations. Last, remember that identical gene sequences don't necessarily result in identical phenotypes. Most traits are the result of the action of multiple genes or multiple copies of a given gene. Most genes are affected somewhat by environmental conditions or metabolic limitations or pleiotropic effects, so all genes show some norm of reaction that affects the phenotype. The norm of reaction is the average and range of a trait across different environmental conditions. Biologists have had many definitions for adaptations since the middle of the 20th century. We will use the definition of an adaptation as an inherited trait that has been crafted primarily by natural selection that makes an organism better fit to its environment. Natural selection must have shaped the trait to serve the same primary function or functions that makes it beneficial today. Exaptations are adaptations that were derived from earlier traits that served a different function in the past. These definitions allow evolutionary biologists to make hypotheses about the evolution of traits to test for fitness benefits. It's easy for us to visualize the evolution of traits that are coded for by a single gene. It's easy for us to work with genes that have a narrow norm of reaction and little environmental influence. Remember, though, a gene is a recipe for making a single protein. That single protein may have a significant effect on the whole organism function, say the gene that codes for the beta hemoglobin chain, or it might have a less quantifiable effect on a whole body. Most traits are the result of several genes expressed with some variation during the lifespan. Behavioral traits might be reflexively inborn, or they might be the result of learning. Although gene sequencing is cheap now, we have much less complete knowledge of the whole proteome of any organism throughout its lifespan. The good news for evolutionary biologists is that we don't have to know all of the minutiae of a trait's development. We only need to examine the condition of the trait and see what kind of fitness benefit it confers. Darwin pictured natural selection to be a slow and gradual process that eventually results in phenotypic novelty. Today, we understand that complicated or novel traits often arise not from simple base pair substitutions within genes, but larger-scale duplication of genes or larger portions of DNA. Gene recruitment is the production of new traits by the duplication of genes that code for proteins that have slightly different but related functions. If we were to start with a length of DNA that includes a protein-coding DNA and a couple of upstream regulatory regions, and duplicate that, we'd have no loss of information, but no novel information produced either. With two copies of a gene, it's free to be able to diverge. In this case, you might see that a regulatory region in one copy mutates so the gene doesn't get turned on as it did before the duplication. At this point, there are a few different possible mutational outcomes. The one copy could mutate into a pseudogene, so it ceases to code for normal protein. Each gene, by changing its regulation, might specialize to have just one of the functions of the original gene, or alternatively, one gene could evolve a new regulation and a new function for what it's actually going to be doing for the body. And this process of gene duplication and recruitment is probably responsible for the greatest amount of phenotypic divergence in living things. We see examples of this in the evolution of homeobox genes for body segmentation in animals, the venom delivery apparatus of crotamine snakes, and in Darwin's own example of the vertebrate eye. But for all this, there are some things that natural selection can't do. There are constraints on the kinds of phenotypic novelty that are possible. Some of these are caused by pre-existing developmental plans that are required in order to build the body. Some traits are constrained by differences in body size, which is why most actively flying animals are usually small, or why most oceanic mammals are large. A rule to remember is that natural selection is not goal-oriented. Individuals are competing against members of their own species for food or shelter or mates and to avoid predation. Natural selection doesn't do perfect. It only does better than. Part of the reason animals' development is so complicated is because it requires various workarounds that have evolved to try to ameliorate traits that are limited in their construction. For example, raptor birds have evolved a circulatory structure called the pecten that hyperoxygenates their retinal cells to give them better visual acuity than most mammals. The good news is that living things don't need to be perfect in order to survive and have offspring. They typically just have to be better than average. If you're trying to outrun a bear, you don't have to run as fast as a car, you just have to run faster than your hiking partner. I think I should leave that in.